Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Robert Curnutte. He's also a social studies major. He wants to teach someday, like myself. Actually, funny story. So he's doing the cultural effects of professional wrestling. And when I was assigned to introduce him, Professor Munson and my colleagues were peer pressuring me to, run in with like a luchador mask and tights and introduce him that way. And for a second, I was like, that'd be really funny. And then after that, I was like,
you said yes at the time.
I did, but I realized I am not gonna embarrass myself like that. So sorry, everyone. So I interviewed Rob, and he said he loves history. And when I asked him why, he said, I don't know, I just do. He loves sports history, pop culture. He's a big Laker fan, such as myself. He told me that the history of wrestling is something not many people and historians touch on, and that's one of the reasons why he chose this topic. And everyone in this department knows that he's a huge procrastinator, so he probably wrote this whole presentation in like 2 hours before, so it's true. Without further ado, Mr. Robert.
Wasn't 2 hours before, maybe the slideshow was, but my presentation is on the cultural effects of professional wrestling. Pro wrestling is one of the oldest popular sports in the world, specifically in the U.S. also. It was really popular when it first came over here in the 1800s. It's seen a lot of highs and lows. Back in the early 1900s, it was big, but now people don't take it as like a legitimate sport because it has a fixed ending, and so they see it as like a male soap opera basically. So yeah, I love my soap operas. Up until the last 6 months or so, sports writers and sportscasters haven't done daily reporting on pro wrestling, but it started to pick up recently. But so it's starting to get a little bit more legit. But it shows the difference that America looks at wrestling than other countries, because in Japan, like places like Japan, it's on the same level as sumo wrestling, which is different. It's not fixed, and you guys know what sumo wrestling is, and baseball. So baseball's huge in Japan also. So it gets reported the same. They don't say like, oh, it's fake. They take it as like a real thing. So that's basically like how it's big in Mexico too, with their luchadors. So and they take it very serious out there also. But despite the negative feedback it gets in the U.S. When it comes to wrestling, the sport has a vast amount of history that is often forgot about. Wrestling has affected the U.S. in pop culture and even in the civil rights movements. But the accomplishments and movements that the sport has created are often overlooked and forgotten about. This research of mine is going to look at the early history of professional wrestling and how it shaped culture and inspired and influenced so many people, including a few unlikely American icons. And the first explanation of wrestling came in 1764 from Richard Curnutte in his publication, The Survey at Cornwall, which is about Cornish wrestling. He said that Cornwall wrestlers wore short jackets and gripped one another's sleeve and shoulders as in modern judo. A standard trick involved trapping the right arm and then back heel tripping. The Cornwall style was called in play. They also wore shin guards and clogs and were allowed to kick one another in the shins. So, yeah, it's a fun time. But these were the first basically professional wrestling, because before, there's the Greco-Romans and wrestling in Rome, like during the Olympics and stuff, way back hundreds of years ago. But this was like what was considered the first professional, and in 1806, this is when they started being in circuses and carnivals and stuff. And it was one of the main attractions. Like it was like side by side with boxing, so it shows how important it was. It was mainly only a sport like this in the UK until 1830, when the Irish immigrants brought it to New England. They introduced the collar and elbow wrestling in and it was often used to end their arguments pretty much when they were fighting over stuff. But it became a huge thing during the Civil War, and even before that, Abraham Lincoln was known to wrestle. So it was basically like off of what the Irish brought over. And the techniques for this collar and elbow is what was the basis for American wrestling when it rose in 1870s and 1880s. And obviously, like you can see that it rose in the 1880s because that's when sports became a big deal in America. Leroy Ashby touched on this in his book with Amusement for All: History of American Pop Culture. By the 1880s, he said by the 1880s, popular mass sports, which the middle class had once rejected as debilitating waste of time, were booming. Sports, according to the emerging ideology, would improve health, advance a moral social order, build character, discourage effeminacy, and divert sexual energies from the bedroom to the more innocent setting of the playing field. Even the mere watching of an athletic contest could reportedly be a transforming experience. This is the collar and elbow for the Irish. Another reason wrestling was on the rise, according to Gerald Morton, was because it grew on the fringes of respectability also. So because there was a lot of betting in it, and it wasn't like baseball. Like when baseball came out, it wasn't like a league kind of. It was just kind of like there was a lot of betting and legal stuff going on, like how boxing also went about too. So there's a lot of similarities between wrestling and boxing with that, with how it was so there were fixes, but it wasn't like fixing wrestling now. It was a fix of like, oh, we want this guy to win because he's an underdog and we're gonna make a lot of money, basically. And during this rise of wrestling in the 1880s, an African American named Vero Small, his wrestling name was Black Sam, was able to wrestle whoever he wanted. He was a former boxer, but he transitioned into wrestling because there was a lot more segregation in boxing during this time. Because boxing didn't have their first black world champion until 1903, and they had to move the fight to Canada because there was so much racial tension because it was supposed to be in New York for boxing. So yeah, he was a black wrestling champion, mainly in Vermont is where he won his championships, but he went all over the place, touring around. He won dozens and dozens of fights throughout his career, but he was attacked by someone he beat, a white man that he beat. The white man shot him, and because he didn't die, the white dude didn't go to jail. So basically, yeah, so it's like, oh, if he dies, you're going to jail. But so he didn't die, he recovered, and he kept wrestling, even though he got shot. He kept going on with the sport. One of the reasons that my bad. Oh, and also, like when you look at wrestling, you see that hey, like black people were able to wrestle. It wasn't until like the 50s that sports like the MLB and the NBA didn't have black players in their leagues. So, but wrestling, like after Vero Small, wrestling hit its peak in the early 1900s during the era of Frank Gotch and George Hackenschmidt. Frank Gotch on the right, George Hackenschmidt. His measurings, if you guys know who Brock Lesnar is, a UFC fighter, and he's also a wrestler. His measurings are around the same. So think of a 1900s Brock Lesnar, which is crazy, huge. The Associated Press in 1908 reported that Hackenschmidt was the greatest wrestler of his time. He was also known as the Russian Lion, and he was the world champion leading into their fight. Hackenschmidt was so popular and renowned that President Roosevelt said upon meeting the champion at the White House, "If I weren't president, I want to be George Hackenschmidt." So, yeah, that's like one of my favorite quotes ever. Hackenschmidt's fight with Gotch drew a crowd of 8,000, which was unheard of during this time because of traveling constraints. No one could fly anywhere to see a fight. Cars were still in early development during this time, so to be able to draw a crowd of 8,000 was a huge deal. They were such a big deal that fans of all ages collected cabinet cards and postcards with their images, read their books, and devoured articles about them in the newspapers. Their epic matches were front page news around the world, akin to today's Super Bowl or soccer's World Cup in terms of garnering global attention, and helped to launch organized wrestling in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. Gotch would go on to win, and that would launch him into superstardom in the United States. In his biography, it said that he was in demand for public appearances everywhere. He starred in a play called All About. Yeah, so, and whenever he walked on stage, he was greeted by a standing ovation. He attended a Cubs baseball game at Wrigley Field, and after the game, nearly every member of the Cubs team came to his private box and to get his autograph, so that's how big of a deal he was that the Cubs players were asking for his autograph, and he didn't ask for theirs, so. He also, his matches also outdrew heavyweight championship boxing matches. So wrestling was at its peak during this time. He even wrestled an exhibition match inside the White House in front of President Roosevelt. So, and then before long, the press dubbed him peerless and a non-feral. It showed how big of a deal he was when he died at age 39. In his hometown of Humboldt, Iowa, every store closed down. The schoolyard was shuttered and empty. And on the day of his funeral, thousands of weeping mourners gathered from many parts of the land, trudged the icy path to the Earl Cemetery on a cold December day to bid a final farewell to the farm boy, who had been the greatest wrestling champion in history. And it was, I think, it was in the 1960s that there was like the top 50 sports stars in the United States. Frank Gotch was listed as one of them. So now he's like a known name, nobody knows who he is. So, but in the 50s and 60s, people still knew about him. He was still a big deal. But after he died, popularity for wrestling started to wane, and because the matches were tedious, like with their length, they sometimes lasted up to 2 to 3 hours, and so so fan support and some of the locks that they got into with each other, like it would like they wouldn't be able to counter for they'd be locked in for like an hour. So and it was also because if you weren't in attendance, especially if you weren't in attendance, it was hard to listen to that on the radio. So that's when wrestling started to become what people call fake now. It just has a planned ending. So by about 1925, the fixed outcome made the matches faster paced, and they wouldn't last as long. So it would give more entertainment value to the fans in attendance and to those listening on the radio. And it would also make it to where they could have more matches on the cards as well. So there was a lot more making money in wrestling with the matches fixed. So so wrestling reached its first golden era with Gorgeous George. His name was George Raymond Wagner, and his popularity was so overwhelming that stores would put on because this is during the 50s when TV started getting really big after World War II, and stores would put in the window their TVs on, and people would gather around just to watch his matches because they loved to hate him and they wanted to see him get his butt kicked. So he was the first wrestler to take advantage of television by creating his persona because he was very flamboyant, very feminine. The persona in wrestling is known as a gimmick, and so he basically created like what a gimmick is. Like the wrestlers, like nowadays they have their little act, their character, the way they are, and he was kind of like television's first villain also. So he's known as that. And one of the first things he did to attract a lot of attention was he married his wife in the middle of the ring, and he did this like several times though. But people kept showing up to see the whole thing. But what really made him hated was how he began coiffing his blonde hair, coming to the ring to the sound of pomp and circumstance. He had a valet named Jeffries at his side who would spray disinfectant around the arena. The disinfectant was actually Chanel No. 5. And Jeffries would throw rose petals around his feet. So his act became an instant sensation, and this was due to the fact that his character wasn't masculine. And it took place one of the most masculine sports, and especially in the 50s, masculinity was like really a big deal. Especially because that's when John Wayne was really big with his movies, and he was the biggest movie star in Hollywood at the time, and all of his movies pretty much promoted masculinity. Russell Mead, professor of journalism and mass media, said that John Wayne was a crucial figure in articulating the boundaries and anxieties of a modern capitalist transnational masculinity in the 1950s, providing an important and resonant fantasy of male identity in a world being transformed by international, social, economical, and political forces. So it's understandable that his character was hated for how feminine he was, because sometimes he came out with curlers in his hair. So yeah, so he was just a really out there guy, but it wasn't just his looks that infuriated the audience. It was the way that he taunted the crowd and made cocky and arrogant faces at them, and he'd scream at them, as well as like screaming at his opponents and trash talking them. And if someone touched him, if the referee touched him, he would smack the referee and say, "Get your hands off me," which people hated. But Gorgeous George was a huge deal, and people forget about him a lot. But he inspired several American icons. One of the first ones was that he impressed was a young Cassius Clay. I had to get the one with WrestleMania with Hulk Hogan. So, everyone knows who Muhammad Ali is. He was impressed by George's boasting and noticed the electrifying effect it had on the crowd. He thought the loudmouth act would work for him, and he was right. Ali said, "Soon after I turned pro, I discovered that even though I won the Olympic title, I wasn't making any money. I was the only champion that didn't have no Jack Jinglin in his jeans. So I studied Gorgeous George and began doing his act better than he did. Wasn't for him, nobody would have heard of me," Ali insisted. One of the next people that Gorgeous George inspired was Bob Dylan, a young Bob Dylan when he was still known as Robert Zimmerman. Dylan was playing at a lobby on a makeshift platform, and he felt like nobody was paying attention to his performance. Eventually, Gorgeous George walked in. Bob Dylan said that he roared in like a storm. It was Gorgeous George in all his magnificent glory, with all the lightning and vitality you'd expect. He had valets and was surrounded by women carrying roses, wore a majestic fur-lined gold cape, and his long blonde curls were flowing. He glanced towards the sound of music. He didn't break stride, but he looked at me, eyes flashing with moonshine. He winked and seemed to mouth the phrase, "You're making it come alive." Whether he really said it or not, it didn't matter. It's what I thought I heard him say that mattered, and I never forgot it. It was all the recognition and encouragement I would need for years to come. So yeah, Bob Dylan, inspired by Gorgeous George. The third man was the godfather of soul, James Brown. Brown incorporated Gorgeous George's wild theatrics and the cape that George would wear to the ring. According to one of Mr. Brown's, according to someone close to James Brown, he said that Mr. Brown got the idea for the cape routine, which became like a trademark after seeing Gorgeous George wrestling on TV. Brown was influenced by George's energy, emotion, and passion. In his own memoir, I Feel Good, James Brown said that Gorgeous George was one of his greatest influences, and he said, in quote, "The wrestler Gorgeous George, one of the great early stars of live TV who added a special flamboyance to his matches, inspired me." So, Brown watched Gorgeous George on television and was enthralled with George's cape, his struts, and the nicknames he gave himself, like the Toast of the Coast, the Sensation of the Nation. Brown would later wear the cape, curl his hair like George, and call himself the hardest working man in show business and the godfather of soul. So it became as if the two men were kind of the same act, just they were in different venues of show business, pretty much. The effects that Gorgeous George had on American pop culture is something that is vastly underlooked in the history of the U.S. Not only did George inspire several different icons in American pop culture, but he inspired cartoons made after his likeness. One of them was Ravishing Ronald, a Bugs Bunny cartoon, the one on the left. They got the two names with the R, just like the two names with the Gorgeous George, Ravishing Ronald. So even a Bugs Bunny cartoon he was in. He was also in they also parodied him in The Simpsons. The family finds an old box of flamboyant wrestling attire. These items belong to Homer's father, Abe, who had a career in wrestling that was loosely based off Gorgeous George. Mr. Burns recognized him as Gorgeous Godfrey, a flamboyant villain from early TV wrestling, and a takeoff of the real Gorgeous George. The Simpsons have always been one of the top shows to play a parody and show respect to people throughout history. As quoted that while satire is utilized in The Simpsons effectively so, parody recognizes, pays respect to, and openly serves to authorize the original text. This respect is shown in a silly way when the return of Gorgeous Godfrey is announced as America's original vainglorious bastard. So, kind of like Gorgeous George was. He was the original villain that was flamboyant. So, transitioning from Gorgeous George. This is Sputnik Monroe. Wrestling helped a great deal in civil rights issues in the South, specifically in Memphis, Tennessee. While wrestling in the 1950s, the Washington Times reported that black fans sat in their restricted sections for wrestling matches until Monroe embraced those fans and demanded they be allowed to sit where they wanted. Monroe had pulled due to his drawing power because of his villainous antics, which is called a heel in wrestling terms. This made people want to watch Monroe get beat and lose. It was rare for a white American to go against what was considered the norm and fight for the rights of black Americans in wrestling, especially the crowd, because even though Jim Crow laws were gone by this time, they were still being used in effect in the 50s. So, there used to be, Sputnik Monroe said there used to be a couple thousand blacks wanting inside. So I would tell management I'd be cutting out if they don't let my black friends in. I had the power because I'm selling out the place, the first guy that ever did it, and they sure wanted the revenue. Robert Gordon, a historian who wrote a book called It Came from Memphis, said that they knew how many blacks the sections could hold. Sputnik paid the guy who counted the blacks to say a low number every time he was asked. So when the boss said, "How many have you let in?" he would say 25 or whatever, and there was 500 people up there. Finally, the audience got so big and so heavily black that they had to integrate the seating. That really is how integration in Memphis started. There's no other single event that integrated the audience other than wrestling matches and Sputnik paying the guy to lie. So, city officials also weren't pleased with Monroe's association with black people. He said that this is one of the articles for when he got arrested for hanging out at a cafe at a black cafe with people. So he said he went straight to Beale Street where the blacks hung out, and from there straight to jail and got Sarah Mon, the black attorney, to defend me in court. They charged me with mopery and attempted gawk. That's an old vagrant thing they made up. I was on Beale Street every night for the first 6 months. I got arrested 3 or 4 times until that didn't work anymore, and the cops left me alone. So even though he was being pressured by the city and getting arrested, he kept supporting black people because he wasn't gonna let anyone deter like what he believed in. The funniest part of how he got the name Sputnik, he picked up a black hitchhiker and brought him to one of the wrestling shows, and he had him backstage, and this old lady started cussing at him, and so basically the security told her she needed to stop cussing and she needed to calm down. and this is such a funny story, and then she said, "You're nothing but a Sputnik." So, and basically, like, this is in the 50s, and so, the late 50s, so basically it was because the satellite Sputnik that was sent up into the space by, okay. How about the last page? The effect that Monroe had on wrestling and racial culture in the South was huge. The actions he took couldn't be done in other sports because of the wrestling had theatrics, basically, and wrestlers had charisma and ability to speak to the crowd. In baseball, you couldn't just start talking to people while you're playing. So, and then you flash forward to the 80s until now, and it's easy to see how wrestling had an effect on pop culture. Hulk Hogan became a sensation in America because he went up against Nikolai Volkov, who was from the Soviet Union, and the Iron Sheik, who was from Iraq, and there was tensions because of the Cold War, and then tensions with the Middle East, and so that's how wrestling uses what's going on in America to make their wrestlers big. And so, it kind of had a downfall after Hogan, and then recently there's The Rock. Well, by the time he became famous, that's when wrestling became like really big in pop culture, magazines, being on TV Guide. He's right now, like, he's not a wrestler anymore, but he was the second highest grossing actor last year. So that's how big of a reach wrestling has, because he still shows up to the WrestleMania and to a lot of the shows. Oh, and Hogan also had one of the best reality TV shows on TV. It was one of the most watched ones. It was called Hogan Knows Best in the mid 2000s. And then there's The Rock also created a word, SmackDown. That's in the dictionary now. That's because of him. There's John Cena. He's been in a bunch of movies. Most recently, Trainwreck, which was a huge financial success. He's done more Make-A-Wishes than any celebrity. He's done over 500. I don't think anyone's done 300 yet. So, and the number keeps going up, going up and up. WWE, they have over 500 million social media followers on all social media. They have the most watched video. They're the most watched channel on YouTube, and their weekly cable show, Monday Night Raw, is the most watched cable show on TV also. So their reach is really huge. WWE also they do a tribute to the troops every year. Back when we were still in Iraq, they went to Iraq every year and performed in front of the troops. And they've done a lot of good. They support cancer, and every October for the whole month they sell pink merchandise. And now over the last 6 months they've created a partnership with ESPN, which highlights Monday Night Raw every week. And yeah, well, I'm almost done. But needless to say, through the WWE and its family-friendly product, it's making waves throughout pop culture in the U.S. today. Whether it be through their unique characters and stories that inspire young minds, their athletic feats, all the movies and shows that these wrestlers appear in, the charity work, and communicating to fans through social media, wrestling has a great effect on the culture in the United States. And even though the effect waned for a bit, it's now starting to come back at an all-time high. And that's it.
So now we're gonna take questions, and I'll ask the first one. It's really generic, but what were your most useful primary sources, and were they difficult to find?
Actually, no. Like my most useful ones, because this is only 10 pages of 36 pages. So, but my most useful ones were the ones from the 1800s that I found. I found a lot of newspaper articles. So I found them right away. Like there was a whole gallery like online of someone who collected all these articles. So that was it gave me a lot of primary sources.
Roughly how many wrestling matches have you been in?
I've only been to one. I went to WrestleMania last year in San Jose.
Was it cool?
It was the best day of my life.
You.
I know you touched on a lot of the positives in your presentation. Did you ever get into any of the negative effects that wrestling has brought back?
No. I'm biased. Maybe.
Do you know why there was less segregation in wrestling compared to other sports, or like even compared to boxing?
I think it was less organized compared to boxing like during that time. So, and there was more betting in it, but yeah, that's what I found out.
So at what point did wrestling become an international thing? Because I know you said 19-something, like early 1900s, they went to Canada because of the racial tension.
Oh, that was the boxing.
That was the boxing.
Yeah, but it became an international thing probably like in the 80s and during Hulk Hogan and all that. Now it's like actually in the 70s. In the 70s, that's when it got really big in Japan, and they sell out the Tokyo Dome, which is a huge stadium. So.
When did women start becoming participants in wrestling?
Ooh, no, pretty early. One of the most famous one from the early days, I think she wrestled in the 60s, was the Fabulous Moolah. She held like the women's championship for like over like a decade, or like it was like 20-something years. And now actually, if I was on more current stuff, they actually have a thing they're calling it the Women's Revolution now, because women's wrestling's getting a lot more respect in WWE and in wrestling as a whole. And actually, a lot of the